Hi, I'm Jim Zogby, and welcome to Viewpoint. This is our 450th show with Abu Dhabi Television, and it's been a great run. Tonight, on this show, we're going to look at how super PACs are influencing this year's presidential election. We'll do that with Michael Isikoff. He's the national investigative correspondent for NBC News. Then I'll talk to Matt Apuzzo. He's the Associated Press reporter who helped break the story on New York City Police Department spying on ethnic communities. But first, as part of its expanded authority after 9/11, the FBI is collecting racial and ethnic information and mapping American communities based on stereotypes. Here to discuss the FBI activity is Mike German. He's Policy Counsel for National Security and Privacy at the American Civil Liberties Union Washington Legislative Office. He's a 16-year veteran of law enforcement. He served as special agent with the FBI and as counter-terrorism instructor at the FBI's National Academy. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Recently, the FBI announced they brought in a number of community groups and announced that after a review of training manuals, they had deleted hundreds of pages of these manuals that included some pretty outrageous things about Islam and about American Muslims. How big a problem is it? They kind of minimized it, I thought, saying it was 600-700 pages out of 160,000 pages. But how big a problem is it in terms of content?
I think it is a big problem. It's pervasive, and a lot of the material that we released from our Freedom of Information Act request was facially egregious. I mean, you looked at it, and this was stuff that any high school student should have realized was inappropriate. But there are a lot of other materials that are sort of touch on the same themes and aren't so obvious. And one of the issues that we picked up was it isn't just training materials. A lot of the intelligence products that the FBI has put out have these same themes in them, describing Islam as inherently violent and the Muslim American community as not loyal to America and those sorts of problems.
Some examples of what was in the training.
Well, in the training, there were a number of PowerPoint presentations. One said something about how having Muslim faith in a country would set its government back to the 7th century ways, and some really odious type of things. In the intelligence products, there's one particular document we pointed out in a letter to Director Mueller that was so-called radicalization, this idea that there's a path from being a good citizen to being a terrorist. And it identified behaviors that are inherently religious behaviors, Muslim dress, growing a beard, how many times you pray, that if the number of times you pray increases, that somehow means you are increasingly dangerous. So those are the sorts of policies and intelligence products that we want the FBI to resolve.
Here's
as well.
One of the charts that's on there, militancy consideration, and Islam is inclined toward militancy is the basic thrust of it.
Exactly.
The question I have is, how did it happen? And there is a culture there. Sure. It's not just a training manual, because we see one too many of these forms of collaboration with people we know are part of the Islamophobic cottage industry.
Right, exactly.
Doing these training programs, working as consultants, et cetera. How did that culture begin to develop? How deeply rooted is it? And does getting rid of 600-700 pages solve the problem?
So, the FBI, like any other institution, is made up of individuals, and individuals have normal human failings, and bias is one of those. And, I mean, it's particularly disappointing to me because I actually worked within the FBI's training division for a short period of time and saw that there were, appropriate and effective training materials being produced. And I think what happened is that you had, as you said, this cottage industry in producing this Islamophobic material, and they reached into the agency and changed some minds, and some people within the FBI and the other law enforcement and intelligence community started promoting these ideas. And because the FBI's training was not carefully overseen, and it allowed this material to fester, and once you have young agents trained in this, it's only natural that they're going to continue training what they've been learned. So I think it is going to be a bigger problem than just removing those materials, because you have agents, the materials we show go back to 2003. So you have agents that have basically been trained for 10 years with this material, and how you get that out of the culture of the FBI, I think, is going to be far more difficult. And I'm afraid that by minimizing the problem and by not addressing how this material reappears in the intelligence products, I think.
Yeah, I saw the pre-radicalization, the radicalization report,
right.
And the part that troubled me most, I mean, my doctoral work and postdoctoral work was in Islam and in the issue of political transformation. And I read it, and I didn't recognize it from anything I had studied or had
right.
worked on. And in the pre-radicalization phase, they describe basically any convert.
Right.
If you convert for reasons of alienation from your existing religion or trouble in your life or the basic reasons why somebody would convert
right.
anyway, you're considered a person who is susceptible
right.
to radicalization. That's a pretty big field.
It's a huge problem, and it justifies then surveilling or otherwise investigating that community. So it's a theory that justifies a response, and I think that's why it was reached out to. You know, the part that troubles me, again, having been an investigator and been a trained, is that none of this is based on empirical science. You know, none of this is based on evidence. It's just a theory that they acknowledge. It conflicts with the empirical science that when you look at people who actually commit terrorist acts, typically they're not, you know, following any particular profile or any pattern or any linear behavior. That you know, it's a very individual choice, and typically they're not scholars on whatever ideology their activity is supposedly in furtherance of. So part of the problem for me, as a police training program, is that this is not based on empirical evidence and good science. It's based on a flawed theory, and that's only going to produce flawed results.
So it's what I've called before, instead of not connecting the dots, it's forcing the dots to connect and coming up with a profile that basically doesn't tell you anything.
Right. That
tells you what you want to know.
It sets you on the wrong course,
right,
so
right.
you end up spending your investigative effort targeting the wrong people.
If getting rid of 600-700 pages doesn't do it, if calling in the communities and saying, help us get out of this bind doesn't do it, what does do it? What has to happen in the FBI to change this culture?
Well, I think it has to come from the top, and I think it has to be comprehensive. You know, trying to minimize the problem. You know, when we first started releasing these materials, the FBI said, oh, this was a one-time thing. You know, this was just a couple of trainers, where, you know, we found even in the professionally produced materials, there was a textbook that the FBI produced with West Point, that there were materials in that professionally produced textbook that were highly questionable. I mean, one particular essay suggested that in interrogating somebody from the Muslim faith or from the Middle East, you should ask a series of basic questions: what they think about the Iraq War, what they think about the Israel-Palestine situation, what they think about you know, a number of other sort of political issues. And what the essay said was, if they answer in a pro-Western patriotic stance, then they're likely not a militant.
Yeah.
You know, where, you know, it's patriotic in the United States to challenge any government policy.
And so basically, because I oppose the Iraq War and support Palestinian rights, I am suspect.
According to this essay, you would have been a possible militant.
Listen, let's get you out there in the conversation. If you want to call us from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. From the U.S., the number is 1-202-420-5730. Flowing from this is then the FBI mapping. They determine this community as suspect, almost in toto, and therefore deem it important to find out who they are, where they are, what they're doing, and what their institutions are. Describe the process of mapping, what it does exactly to the community.
Okay, the FBI's racial and ethnic mapping program was initiated, was supposed to be initiated in 2008. It was authorized in 2008. And we started issuing Freedom of Information Act requests almost right away, trying to figure out what this program was. And what we've received indicates is what the FBI does is they make sort of crass racial stereotypes about what groups are susceptible to committing what crimes, and then use that crass stereotype as a justification to map the entire racial and ethnic community. So, as you suggested, in Detroit, for instance, we have a communication that suggests that because there is Muslim terrorism around the world, they should map the entire Muslim community in Michigan and find out where all the Muslims live because they are susceptible to being recruited into a terrorist group. And this activity exploits a loophole in the ban on racial profiling. The Department of Justice in 2003 banned racial profiling. The use of race to any degree in any law enforcement investigation absent a suspect description. But it left a loophole for national security investigations. So that's where this activity comes in. But what we found was the FBI used that loophole and drove a truck through it. So they do it in just ordinary criminal activity as well. So in San Francisco, for instance, there was a memo that said that because there has been organized crime in the Chinese community for decades, they should map the entire Chinese community of San Francisco. Because MS-13 is a street gang that has primarily Hispanic members. They should map entire Hispanic communities in New Jersey and Alabama and other states.
They get overwhelmed with data, though, in the process, don't
Exactly. Exactly. And part of the issue is that, we're not a divided community, The American is a melting pot, and we have, so what they're actually getting out of this information is suspect to begin with, that this is somehow helpful. But what we're afraid of is that they're using these maps to then target their surveillance and their investigations.
What kind of surveillance goes into this? I mean, obviously there's a kind of a block by block who lives where, but is there direct personal surveillance activity as well? And how does it work?
Interestingly, we have one document that supposedly examines the black separatist threat, which, I don't know of a lot of black separatist violence for the last 30 years or so. But it actually names two organizations and talks about how they appeared at different public demonstrations and supported a particular congressional candidate. So this is clearly First Amendment activity that, because they are painted with this suspicious label of being a black separatist threat, their First Amendment activity is obviously being...
Is it effective? Is it an effective use of resources? Does it find anything out, or does it simply pollute the FBI with way too much information they can't use?
It's unclear from our documents what they're doing with these maps, but it certainly seems to be a broad foray into demographic collection that really doesn't help to solve crimes when there are real threats out there. And you have to remember, the FBI is not a huge organization, so they really need to focus their resources on.
We have a map of the states that are participating in this process, and it's a pretty big swatch of the country.
Right.
Here's a question I have. If they're conducting surveillance and doing mapping and calling in the community to say, we want to work with you, don't the two conflict?
Well, they conflict in a couple of ways, because one of the things we found, and we put out an alert on our website on this, is that they are exploiting those community outreach efforts for further intelligence gathering. So they're gathering information about what people say at these events and who participates, and even innocuous conversations that they have with the agents about their personal travel or what charities they give money to. So it's a really odious form of investigative activity where they're using this goodwill opportunity and actually exploiting it to collect against the groups.
So it breaks trust.
Right.
Let me go to Wisconsin and take a call. Caller, your question.
Yeah, to me it's obvious, but I'd like to know who's behind these manuals and all this information. Like, I mean, is it connected to some Zionist group or AIPAC? Because it seems like the same people who influenced the gentleman in Norway who killed all those youth. Like, who's behind this? These people are just ridiculous.
I get your point. There is this group, the folks like Robert Spencer and Daniel Pipes and Steve Emerson, et cetera, who've been doing these studies, if you will, the cottage industry we talked about. What connection do they have with all of this?
Well, the Center for American Progress actually put together a pretty good report that tracks a lot of that, you know, where the money for these types of reports is coming from and who's involved. Our concern is that there are people in the government who are promoting this, and you know whether they have just been influenced by those you know private writers, or whether that's just their own personal bias that they're driving through these intelligence products. But the fact that there's no appropriate guidance within the FBI to prevent that from becoming something that is spread throughout the agent workforce is what's very troubling to us.
One final question on this topic, and that is well, no, let me ask you this. Congress 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, passed a provision to open U.S. airwaves to drone flights, which when I saw that, I said, now what could that all be about? Is there a worry here about drone surveillance in America?
Certainly there is. There have been repeated requests by state and local law enforcement agencies to use drones, and it's been FAA regulations that have slowed that down, which is what the provision of the bill is about. DHS has drones that it uses both on the borders, and the DHS considers the border to be 100 miles in from the border. So there is increasing use of drones. One of the things that we've also found in this FOIA is the FBI actually has a geospatial intelligence program. It's unclear from the documents we have what that entails, but in combination with this mapping program, it's certainly possible that they're using drones and or satellites.
You're a sober guy and a thoughtful guy and not a conspiracy pusher.
Right.
But I read 1984 and this sounds scarier. The sort of the wall that the Constitution established between individual rights and the law's overreach seems to have been broken down.
Right. And part of that is that technology over the last 30 years has exploded, giving the opportunity for surveillance both through these new optics that are available and new platforms, but also through our use of computer technology. Means surveillance is much easier for the government. But the privacy laws that we're relying on are still based on a 1970s version of the way we live our lives. So it's really a matter of the fact that the privacy laws haven't kept up with these technological opportunities for exploitation.
Let me go to California for a last call in this segment. Caller, your question.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
Good.
I'm wondering, why the FBI, because they already have a map for who lives where, whatever, go contact with the Muslim community and they see who's the loyalty to the country or not. Because I'm one of the Muslims, live in America. I love America so much. So, I would like to know why the FBI, they don't really go through who love America or who doesn't. And then watch them. Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't they just go to the community, talk to the community, and build ties with the community instead of doing this?
Well, I think part of it is this flawed training. That you have too many agents who are trained to believe all Muslims are suspect, so it's hard to then create a rational framework around investigations, and it's the loosened guidelines that allow the FBI to investigate people without any factual predicate, without any evidence they've done something wrong.
Thanks, Mike German, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And good luck with the work.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to take a look at the influence of super PACs on this presidential election. We'll do that with Mike Isikoff from NBC News. He'll be with us in a minute, so stay tuned.